This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 34. A Shattered Hope. New York is filled with houses of indifference, degraded and degrading old shells, where anyone of however dubious of a calling may rent a shelter, alleged to be furnished, and be certain no questions will be asked, no matter what the use to which the apartment may be adapted. The house where Edith Steck had found her miserable lodging was one of this character, as Stuyvesant realized as soon as he entered the door. He was therefore handicapped at the outset, since no one resident therein would divulge the slightest fact that might be concealed or evaded by ignorance or art. The same dull little female creature who had admitted Thurley opened the door at his knock. She was either half deaf or half idiotic, or an excellent actor of the part. By dint of repeated questions and not a little flattery, Stuyvesant elicited the information that she was not the landlady, that the latter was out and had been for 2 or 3 days, and also that some perfect lady had occupied the room once rented to Miss Steck for several days. The perfect lady had been veiled when she came, and had never been seen by this informant, who was merely a servant in the place. This was deception number 1, for she herself was proprietor of the utterly neglected house. Stuyvesant paid her $1 to take him to the room in question, alleging that a young woman friend had called there that morning and left a trifle behind. The trifle was on the floor when he came to the place. The bunch of roses Thurley had carried to comfort a comfortless soul. Convinced that no one else could have taken them there, Stuyvesant took them eagerly, then glanced about the place. It was simply a wretched little back-hall cave, dirty, ill-smelling, abominably furnished with rickety old junk, and littered everywhere with half-smoked cigarettes. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, to furnish the slightest clue as to recently departed occupants, save the roses already secured. What other parcels Thurley had brought had been carried away with herself. When Stuyvesant left, he possessed the meagre intelligence that the perfect lady of the veil was tall, and that several men had called to pay her their respects at various times. His most skilful corkscrew methods could extract no more than that. As a matter of fact, the wizened little woman knew almost no more herself. She had seen little of her recent guest and nothing of her departure. Stuyvesant acknowledged to himself that he was almost as much in the dark as he had been half an hour earlier. He felt certain that Thurley had actually been in the room and dropped her roses at the moment of some attack. He was convinced it was she who had been seen placed helplessly in an automobile, but concerning the motive, Thurley's condition when abducted, where she was taken, and the perpetrators of the outrage, he was helplessly at sea. He telephoned to Alice, relating the little he had managed to discover, then informed her that he would call by 8 at the latest, deliberately set to work to discover, if possible, the abiding place of Wank and Baron von Hochhaus. Some hazy idea of comforting the Baron, and possibly surprising from him even the merest hint concerning Princess Thurvinia, was in his mind, together with a wonder at himself for daring to presume so far as to meddle with the state affairs of a foreign kingdom and its royal truants. He only knew he loved this glorious girl who had come to his assistance in the park. He only knew he must serve her now, if it lay in his power, with the final drop of blood in his heart. But his search was vain. For more than 2 hours he was driven up and down from one small high-class hostelry to another, before at last he was rewarded by the information that 2 Germans, neither one named Wank or Baron Hotchhouse, but who might have registered under pseudonyms and might have been the parties sought, had stayed in this house 2 days. They had gone together, but no one knew where, as neither received or expected letters here, and had left no future address. It was nearly 8:30 at night, and the storm still raged savagely, when he came again to Alice Van Kirk's, to be mocked by his evening's search. Both Wank and Baron von Hotchhouse had arrived 5 minutes before him, and Alice had just come down. Tempted to send in his name and request admission to the conference, Stuyvesant curbed the impulse and went to the great empty drawing-room to wait impatiently the outcome of this wholly unexpected development. Alice, in the reception-room, had scarcely more than greeted her distinguished visitor, concealing as best she might her state of agitation, when the servant, acting on instructions, quietly announced Robley's arrival. She hesitated a moment on the point of asking Stuyvesant in, then resolved on a course whereby she might a little sound the Baron, and possibly discover vital facts by the policy of permitting him to reveal the purpose of his visit, while she continued to act as if nothing had occurred. The Baron was labouring under rigidly suppressed emotions. Grave fears were entertained by himself and Wank concerning not only the young Duke Karl, but also Princess Thurvinia, still missing and perhaps never to be found. At most, his Secret Service officers had learned that some young woman, exceedingly beautiful and unknown, had recently succumbed to sudden illness in Jersey City, under conditions that vaguely suggested she might have been the royal runaway they sought, and Grand Duke Karl, readily run to cover upon his second visit to the Van Kirk mansion, had madly proclaimed his love for Miss Thurley, whom alone he wished to wed. The Baron was thus doubly bewildered and harassed. If the princess still lived and was discovered, these two must wed and be returned to Herzegovina forthwith. If it should be discovered beyond a peradventure, on the other hand, that Princess Thurvinia had paid for her folly with her life, it might not be altogether preposterous to persuade Miss Thurley, as her double, to assume her royal place. The adjustment of the matter, so delicate, was not a simple affair. The Baron was not in the least discomfited now to discover Thurley temporarily absent from the scene. "I shall approach the subject of my appearance frankly," he said to Alice, as soon as mere conventional greetings had been exchanged, "and perhaps it is as well to request permission to ask a few questions of yourself at once." "Please feel quite at liberty to do so," said Alice, making her excitement and feeling of doubt with a smile. "Perhaps I may be able to assist you." "Please acquit me of any desire to intrude personal curiosity in a matter most exceedingly grave," he begged courteously, "and permit me to apologise in advance for the necessity of pursuing my country's requirements in a matter of some delicacy." Alice nodded, and he continued: "Perhaps Miss Thurley was already acquainted you with the substance of our last conference?" "Oh, yes, to some extent." "That is well, and should save considerable time. May I now inquire what attitude of mind Miss Thurley expressed or betrayed concerning his Excellency the young Duke?" "Why," said Alice, "I think she hardly knew herself." "He was honoured by a carriage visit with yourself and Miss Thurley recently?" He drove with us, yes. I am aware of his instant infatuation with and high regard for your protégé. Is it possible now, or might it ever be possible, for Miss Thurley to requite his esteem, his love, in a word, should occasion arise to make such an outcome desirable or expedient? Alice was certain now the genuine princess was dead and thoroughly politically required. She was almost equally convinced that Thurley had actually been abducted for this reason, and the Baron was here to make all possible amends without, however, relinquishing his captive. She answered incautiously. Was this the reason you desired and requested her to continue in the role somewhat thrust upon her by an overzealous public? He coloured slightly. Certainly not. At the time of that request, no such necessity seemed even remotely suggested. Believe me, madam, there may be no such necessity now. Perhaps I am premature in preparing for any such emergency. I have merely asked you the question. Alice felt a little the constraint of his position. She resolved upon a bolder stroke. A young woman like Thurley might learn to care very dearly for any handsome young man, but not Baron Hotchhouse by force. He looked his genuine surprise. By force? Most certainly not, my dear Mrs. Van Kirk. Miss Thurley's entire cooperation, if not voluntary, spontaneous response to the young Duke, exalted emotion, would be an absolute essential to the furtherance of any such development as fancy and necessity might presuggest at this perhaps untimely moment. Alice had almost hoped for proof that the Baron had procured Thurley's spiriting away. She could have been certain, at least, of the girl's comfort, security, and freedom from violence or danger. Now she underwent a doubt, so entirely candid was the Baron's speech and demeanour. Yet she tried another tact. Is not the question, after all, one to be answered only by Miss Thurley herself? Most certainly, in its finality. Yet I welcomed this opportunity of questioning yourself, her confidant and friend, as a diplomatic forestep should occasion arise for any such negotiations later. It is highly probable that such a proposition may never be broached again. I sincerely trust there may be no such necessity. Indeed, my next inquiry may occasion some astonishment for its opposing character. Alice was thoroughly puzzled, and losing a species of hope to which she had clung, since if Thurley had to be carried off because of foreign politics, it were better far she should be in the hands of the Baron than caught in the toils of conspirators wholly unknown. She grew impatient to demand all the Baron knew, yet still she smiled. "Your next inquiry," she said, "directed also to me?" "It is perhaps just as well directed to you." He leaned a little closer. "In the event of our state's desire in the matter, would it be too much to request Miss Thurley to refuse to see more of the Duke, to discourage him finally once and for all, dismissing this friendship at most, bidding him return forthwith to Herzegovina, there to resume the obligation of his life?" Alice gazed at him blankly, amazed at such a question on the heels of what had preceded. The Baron gave her no time to reply. "I perceive I have too far presumed upon your relationship with Miss Thurley," he hastened to add. "May I beg the privilege of an interview with Miss Thurley herself?" Alice's final hope was gone, and with it her wish or need for further concealment. She rose abruptly. "But, Baron von Hotchhouse, Thurley is not here. She is gone. She has disappeared. I have the most terrible fears for her safety, her life. I hoped that you had abducted her, caused her abduction, anything but this horrible uncertainty and dread." The Baron, too, had risen. His face betrayed his complete astonishment and shock. "Gone?" he repeated. "Abduction? You do not mean to say—" "She went this morning to assist an ailing friend, or so she thought. The letter that summoned her was evidently a forgery, a blind. I am fearfully distraught. Mr. Stuyvesant has been the only one to help me. He has just come in from a fruitless search of the house where she went this morning." The Baron's distress was more than mere compassion, it was grave concern. He had feared for some such development. He had known of the dangers impending and surrounding the putative princess when requesting Thurley to continue the role. He had even made efforts towards the discovery and apprehension of Zagorski and her following, but had felt the discovery of the genuine princess and the protection of the Duke Karl to be more immediate pressure upon himself and his men. Now that this outcome had established the menace to princess and duke, he was startled as well as afflicted with a sense of guilt, yet he dared not betray his convictions as to what had happened to Alice Van Kirk's protégé. "I am shocked at this intelligence," he said in all sincerity. "Believe me, I shall make every possible endeavour to assist you in discovering and recovering your companion. Excluding myself, you have no suspicions as to who might commit such an outrage?" "How could I have?" said Alice. "She hadn't an enemy in the world. I was certain it must be something political, something I may have brought upon her by permitting a silly world to believe her your Princess Thurvinia." The Baron took a quick, impatient turn down the length of the rug and back. His perturbation was obvious. His rage against Zagorski was consuming. "That such a thing could happen in daylight, here in your city," he said. "The punishment should be so swift and terrible for crimes of this dastardly nature. You shall have my help. Did you say Mr. Stuyvesant has come? I esteem him your friend. I may see him now?" "I wish you to see him, please," said Alice, "but he is not aware that Miss Thurley is not Princess Thurvinia, a matter which I prefer to leave undisturbed if possible." "The suggestion meets my entire approval and desire," said the Baron, and Stuyvesant was summoned to the room. The meeting between himself and the Baron was cordial. Then, in the briefest time, he was made acquainted with the Baron's innocence in the present matter, and his earnest desire to promote the greatest possible activity for Thurley's return to her friends. Hotchhouse did not, however, cast an illuminating ray upon the facts in his and Wank's possession concerning Zagorski, and Wank, remaining in the farthest corner of the room, was barely aware that important complications had developed. Stuyvesant related all he had found at the house and room where the trap had been prepared, adding a brief account of the means whereby he had discovered that Edith Steck was still at Lakewood. Reflecting that death could have claimed Princess Thurvinia, the Baron was thoroughly disturbed and incensed. Convinced that an effort would be made to entrap or even assassinate the Duke, he became a wary, sagacious element in the game. Primarily actuated by his country's needs and relentlessly pledged to the conservation of its integrity, no matter what the sacrifice to other beings or their nations. And yet, for the adequate punishment of Zagorski and her lawless followers, he would almost have given a hand or an arm to be lopped from his sinewy body. His agitation seemed to Stuyvesant a confirmation of Thurley's royal character. There was nothing to be done that night, however, save to counsel Stuyvesant to avoid the municipal police and report for a conference the following day with the secret agents imported to search for the princess. The address for which Robley had searched all evening was readily supplied, together with the names under which both the Baron and Wank were registered, after which, with every assurance of his lasting friendship and zealous action in this calamity, Hotchhouse withdrew, leaving Alice and Stuyvesant as well, blindly groping for a hope or a clue upon which to proceed in the morning. End of chapter 34.